Is it all over for Norris? Why is Leclerc even being considered to be penalised for such an epic move? What the is still going on with George's contract? And Horner's not going to Cadillac, so where will he go? But Cadillac, on the other hand, are being too conservative. We answer all of these questions and more in this episode of Your Biggest F1 Questions. I'm Jason Hassett, and welcome to Current and Combustion. Hello everybody, and welcome back to Your Biggest F1 Questions, which I'm recording straight after the Dutch Grand Prix, so I'm sure I'll get a few things wrong that the FIA will clarify since there's investigations and so on still ongoing, which is insane, pisses me off to no end. But without ado, let's jump into the very first question from you, the viewers, and see what we have here straight from the dyno's mouth. Okay, so first question. Why has George's contract been taking so long, asks David. Well, this is from the build-up, obviously. So Toto Wolff has confirmed today, once again, I guess reiterating, but properly confirmed right now, that they will be continuing with George and Kimi for 2026, though. And this seems to be the sticking point here. Now, Toto has basically said, look, it's not even a negotiation, we're just talking and so on. There's been lots of allusions to this by George and, well, not so much by Kimi, but by George and Toto. Look, we know they're going to continue for 2026. The question is, why is this taking so long? Well, it seems to me the simple answer to that is that there is kind of a disparity between George and Toto on this. So George had said that, or at least alluded to, the fact that basically if Max was to have joined for 2026, that it would have been Kimi that was replaced. Now, Toto hasn't confirmed that, but George all but confirmed that fact. And honestly, I'm not that surprised if you were doing it in the short term, given Kimi's performances this year. If you wanted to kind of have the best of both worlds, then and also have a lot of TV coverage with some spicy takes, then having those two together would make sense. But back to the question at hand, the simple fact is, it seems to me that essentially Mercedes want to push ahead with a 1+1. Toto is basically saying, from what I can gather, that there is no negotiation. He just wants a 1+1 and he's expecting George to sign that. It seems like Kimi's extension is done and Kimi is going on to a 1+1. Kimi obviously has less persuasive power and less pulling power to really push back. And I guess Kimi just thinks, well, I can prove myself in 2026. So it seems like at Monza next weekend or during this week, Kimi's extension for 2026 and 2027 will be announced, but that will be a 1+1, and therefore there is an option for Kimi to be removed at the end of 2026 if Max is to jump. It seems like basically the sticking point now is that George wants a 2+1 and Toto wants a 1+1 for both drivers, so that next year he has the option to swap Max in. Now, contracts can always be bought out as expected, but basically if George gets a 2+1 under the way F1 contracts work, George would have to accept the buyout if Toto was to remove him, and George probably wouldn't if the team is where it needs to be. If the team's not where it needs to be, it's a moot point for both of them really, because Max isn't going to join and George may look elsewhere and so on, but that's beside the point. However, the problem that George finds himself in is, I think he's holding out to basically put Toto in a situation of better to have one in the hand than two in the bush, where Toto may just decide, okay, well, look, I don't really want to lose George, because if we don't make the step we're expecting next year, then I could be in a situation where I lose George now. Where's he going to go? Who knows? But the point is, he could lose George now and then not get Max next year, and Kimi underperforms. And then he's in a really poor situation where he doesn't have the fastest car. He no longer has two brilliant drivers, etc., etc. George may be pushing at that. I expect that's what's causing the delay. However, being realistic, as much as I think Toto needs to be a bit careful, because I mean, he's taking a big risk here of not having either driver. And I know that sounds crazy, but, you know, stranger things have happened in F1. I do think for the moment the power is in his hands. And therefore, I reckon George will cave and sign a 1+1. but I would imagine there'll be some sort of performance contract that George wants where the option is automatically taken up basically if he's beating Kimi by X amount or whatever it is. I don't know if Toto's going to sign anything. I think Toto's going to put his foot down and say, look, George, sign the contract. If we have the best car next year, you're winning the title. If we don't, Max isn't coming anyway. So, what have you got to lose? So I think he's holding out just to give himself the best hand. And also, I do think he is probably a little bit peeved about how the media and Toto and everyone handled the whole Max Verstappen contract situation. But yeah, I think at this point in time, it will be signed. I think he's just holding out to try to get that 2+1 instead of a 1+1. I don't think he's going to get it. And like I said, I think he deserves a 2+1 given his contract, given his performance. But I do think as well, just to end this off, I do think as well, Toto just needs to be careful because, sure, it seems like Mercedes will have the best engine next year. It's not a guarantee, but let's just assume it will be. There's nothing to guarantee Mercedes has the best car next year, especially given that, they are losing to McLaren at the moment. So you could end up with a situation next year where both Max and George are pushing to go to an Aston Martin, for example. Or, Max can't go to McLaren, but maybe, Norris continues to have bad luck next year and Norris decides that, in a Ricciardo situation, basically it's not working with him and Piastri. And in that situation, Russell goes to McLaren. Russell could go to McLaren, whereas I don't think a Max would, for example. So, yeah, I think Toto should have been more careful about this. I think the clever thing for Toto would have been to just lock George down and put him alongside Max anyway. So give George a 2+1 and let Kimi try and prove himself next year to the point where you don't need a Max or you can replace him with a Max if you really feel it. But yeah, that's the holdup. I think for right now, look, Toto wants Max, which is understandable. But I think it could backfire on him in the long run, just because I've watched F1 for long enough to know these things aren't simple and things could go wrong for Toto over time. But we'll see. For right now, I guess it's the pragmatic decision, isn't it? Whether you're Christian Horner looking for new job opportunities while still on gardening leave or visiting a printing shop in Woking to send some Ferrari files to a mate at McLaren, you're going to want to make sure your digital footprint is protected. And that's where I use NordVPN. Whether you want to just watch your favorite content while on holidays or check your banking information while on a pesky Starbucks public Wi-Fi, NordVPN has you covered. It keeps your digital footprint completely encrypted and it does it faster than a Sauber team. And I mean Sauber in 2025, not the bad Sauber from 2024. And the best part is you can get NordVPN with 77% off on a 2-year deal plus 4 months free for a limited time only using my link nordvpn.com/Hassid, which will be in the link in the description and the first comment. And even better than that, you can get a 30-day money-back guarantee. So unlike an F1 driver switching to Ferrari, you don't need to have any regrets. And you can check it out now. So thank you for watching and thank you to NordVPN. And now let's get back to the video. Jeff says, what do you think of Tom Bassis saying the 2026 engine rules aren't finalized yet? Yeah, so this is a strange one because, I mean, for the most part, they are finalized. And they would have to be because obviously the teams have spent not only a lot of time, but lots and lots of money. There was talk that Alpine would have been spending roughly $50 to $90 million a year at one point on the 2026 rules, especially because, in the build-up, there's not as strict regulations on the investment. You're also having to build up facilities, not just the engine, all these sorts of things. So to change the rules would be interesting. But I guess the point of this is they have kept some part of the regulation open to interpretation to the point of they can change things. Again, the way I need to phrase this is, it's not so much that they'll just out and out change the rules if, for example, they find out that Mercedes have gotten a massive margin over Ferrari, for example, or over Audi. It's more, I guess, that these rules are open to interpretation as always. And I think what he's saying is they reserve the right to close up any interpretive moments or interpretive regulations here. So, for example, let's say that the rules could be interpreted that you can build the hybrid motor or the battery to do X thing, and it will give you a huge advantage, and the investment to do it would be massive. The FIA basically reserves the right to say, no, sorry, Mercedes, that's not allowed, and we're clarifying those rules with this technical directive, and therefore it closes everything up, right? As we see with flexi wings, with everything else all the time in the rest of the regulations, I would gather that's more what they're talking about. Basically, keeping themselves in a situation where there's not, some sort of huge thing that could be found that would give Mercedes such a big advantage that we have another 2014. And in fact, when they were talking about this, they essentially did say pretty blatantly, we don't want another 2014 with these engine regulations. Now, the thing I will say is I would not be surprised if they don't clamp down in such a way to do that. I would say that they would more likely issue technical directives for 2026 into 2027 to give the manufacturers time to change these things, to allow a manufacturer who finds something crazy to at least enjoy the benefits of it if it's within the regulations and just open to interpretation for a certain amount of time. So I think how that will be handled will be interesting, but I think it's more of a warning shot to the teams not to push it with their interpretations, not to go too deep into those gray areas because the FIA basically wants to clamp down. Now, in a more grand scheme of looking at what this means, though, outside of the actual black and white interpretations of the regulation, I think it does say a lot about how concerned the FIA is about this regulation set. And, look, I give the FIA a lot of stick constantly because, well, they deserve it. But I think this is the FIA basically reacting to the fact that the FOM has put them in a pretty poor, like a piss poor situation here. Because look, FIA have kind of final say. They own Formula One to an extent, but the commercial rights holder basically was setting the tone of these regulations from the outset because FOM, Liberty Media, wanted to get more manufacturers in and essentially have painted themselves into this corner of what could be a pretty shit regulation set if it goes as expected, by pushing for these new hybrid 50% power units. And that's boxed them into this corner. And the FIA have been reactive to that over the past few years. And we've seen that from how the chassis is going. Instead of focusing on dirty air and better racing, they've instead been focusing on how to make up for the downsides of the engine, which is a bad situation to be in. And I think this is just another thing of the FIA trying their best to give them some credit for a change to ensure that they can stay on top of the racing not being terrible. But yeah, I think my concern is saying this so late tells us that they're probably concerned that one or two teams at least, or one or two engine manufacturers at least, are going to have a huge advantage over the others. And that, for example, Mercedes may find like half a second to a second purely in the engine, which would mean that, the Mercedes powered teams, McLaren and Mercedes, for example, could end up being, vastly ahead of everyone else, while Ferrari and, everyone else sits way back and they're trying to basically get on top of that. So yeah, look, I wouldn't read too much into it for now, but it's yet another example of just a bit of dread and fear that this new regulation could take us from what we have now, which is an extremely close field. Unfortunately, McLaren being far ahead of it since the technical directive, but a situation where we could go from having just an incredibly close field spread of like 2/10 being the difference between 3rd and 15th in qualifying to another 2014 where, Mercedes are a second ahead at the front of the field. So it is a little bit worrying, but I'm not going to read too much into it for now. I guess we'll have to see next year, but it's a little bit concerning that they're saying stuff like that this late into the regulation build-up. Next question. Let's see what we got here. Alina says, why would they penalize Leclerc's epic move? Yeah, so this is obviously being recorded before the investigation after the race and everything goes through. This is obviously talking about the move on George Russell at the second to last corner through the chicane, which was absolutely epic to watch. You know what? Why they would do it? Because there is a good chance that he has broken the rules, which is unfortunate, right? So I've kind of complained about these rules. I complained about these overtaking rules last year at Austin, and people shouted basically, yeah, it was fine at Austin. I said, okay, well, just wait and see, because the way the rules are interpreted, it's going to come back on you. And then it immediately came back on Max at Mexico. They have changed those rules for this year. And then, we saw obviously Piastri taking perfect advantage of them in Jeddah. And, they've been pretty good so far. But the problem is with how prescriptive they are is that George, I think in this situation, placed his car perfectly so that he didn't have to give Leclerc any racing room. Now, Leclerc just went for it anyway, and it was spectacular. And I think it's such fine margins with these rules that I really wish they weren't so prescriptive, because I think in that situation, with such a ballsy move, I know there was contact and so on. I think Leclerc should just be given that one. It's like, look, bravo, fair play, incredible fucking move. Let's just let it go. But yeah, to explain fully what I mean by this is, first of all, I think the actual interpretation of what's being investigated is causing a collision. It wasn't overtaking off track. So it's nothing to do with the fact that he was all four wheels off, because I think he did go over the line at one point, but while he was taking the move, he had at least one wheel inside the white line. So I think he was fine there. And the fact that the graphic that showed up was causing a collision tells me that it doesn't have anything to do with him overtaking off track or gaining a lasting advantage or whatever. It's basically that he wasn't entitled to room, and therefore it's treated as causing a collision. Now, if you're watching this after this whole thing has been unfurled and the FIA finally gets off their arse and actually investigates this, and I'm wrong, my apologies. I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments, but that's my take on it at the moment. Now, the problem is that basically whether you're when you're overtaking on the inside, which Charles was doing, because he went around the outside, but I believe that basically went around the outside coming into the corner, but by the time he's overtaking, it's on the next corner, at which point he's overtaking on the inside. Again, correct me if I'm wrong there, but that would be my interpretation of it. If you're overtaking on the inside, you don't need to be technically ahead in order to gain room. This is where there was all the confusion with Jeddah, people complaining and so on. And it's like, look, they're like, oh, well, Piastri wasn't ahead of Max. It's like, well, he was according to the rules, right? So not according to just physics of being ahead, but in terms of how the rules are set. What I mean by that is, in order to be given full racing room and to be entitled to the corner, when you're overtaking on the inside under the 2025 rules, and you can go and look at these regulations, I'm pretty sure they're public now, he essentially has to have the front axle, or the center of his front wheel, alongside the mirror of the car on the outside, which is George at this point. Now, when you're overtaking on the outside, I think you have to be further ahead. I think your axles have to be aligned. I think it is. I could be wrong on that as well. But essentially, if Leclerc at the apex of the corner had his front axle alongside the mirror of George, then he's entitled to room. Now, the problem with that is he's taking a very tight line, because he's going around on the outside first, then coming on the inside. So it's harder for him to get ahead there, which means George can just kind of keep the throttle in a little bit and therefore keep his mirror ahead of Leclerc. George knows these rules inside and out, as does Leclerc. Piastri is very, very good at it. Max was very, very good at it last year. Seems to have had some trouble adapting to this year's regulation set, although I think he has now. But in the first couple of races was a bit difficult. He was used to the old way. But it seems like George was able to just kind of push on, and therefore Leclerc wasn't entitled to any room, and George basically ran him completely out of room, pushing him all the way onto the gravel, which then means that obviously it's very hard for Leclerc to wash out. Now, I think in this situation, if we didn't have these deeply prescriptive regulations of, like I said, you need to have, your front axle alongside the mirror to be entitled to room, and therefore he wasn't entitled to room, and therefore he's probably going to get some sort of penalty, which means a grid drop for next week, even though he was taken out by the other Mercedes. If you didn't have these prescriptive regulations, you could say, well, look, you know what? There was plenty of room for George to leave there. George had the better racing line, so George should have just left him room. I think, if anything, it's a racing incident. And at most, you just don't give a penalty, basically. But unfortunately, because of these prescriptive rules, I would imagine that unless they can find a camera angle where Leclerc is ahead of the mirror, Leclerc's going to get a penalty, which it just annoys me. I think it's just too prescriptive. And the problem is, and I said this last year at Austin, right? Because last year at Austin, we had a situation where, now they have fixed this, to be fair, but my point is, last year at Austin, because of the way the rules are prescriptive, the car overtaking on the outside had to be fully ahead at the apex, which meant that the car on inside, as Max showed, could essentially just lift off the brakes or keep the foot in as late as possible. And then the car on the outside can't go around because the car on the inside can just force you off, and then you're gone. And the defending car basically had a simple way to win, right? And I complained about this. People were like, no, it's just, Max just raced better, etc. I was like, fine, Max played it well, but the rules are wrong. And then obviously at Mexico, Norris did the opposite of just keeping his foot in around the inside, knowing he was ahead. And therefore, even no matter what Max did, Norris could just go off and Max would be forced off then, and that was just that, So this year we've got the opposite, where it's easier for the overtaking car to do something similar. It's easier for the inside driver to overtake on the inside by just forcing ahead. But likewise, because of how prescriptive it is, if you know the regulations, you can just keep your foot in, and that way you just win anyway. So essentially, it's just a game of, who can keep their foot in the longest, and there's no real skill to it then, because Leclerc's move was spectacular. That was real racing, that was hard. And to be frank, I don't think either of them should get a penalty. I think it was just hard racing there. If anyone should get a penalty, in my books, not under the regulations, it should be George. He should have left a bit of room there, but that's not how the regulations are written. So I think this over prescription is quite annoying. It's good in some way for us fans because I can watch it now, and when I see it, I know immediately what a penalty is and isn't. And we get some consistency by the FIA. But I just think when you make it this prescriptive instead of using common sense, I think the problem is it's just too easy to game by everyone. And I think the only real solution to this is to have, consistent paid stewards who know racing, and it's not this prescriptive because they're proper racers who can watch it. And I would rather have a couple of bad calls than just being able to game the overtaking every time. So yeah, I think he's probably going to get a penalty for that epic overtake as per the rules from the cameras that I saw. Obviously, it'll be corrected by the time this comes out, maybe. But yeah, just another example of I think George should have just left a bit of room there, but under the regulations isn't entitled or isn't obligated to. So it's a bit of a pain. But, here we are. Just, it is what it is. Okay, next question. Bob, who will finish third in the championship? Interesting question, Bobito. Yeah, so honestly, this is an interesting one because I would have said before this weekend that it would be George. I still think it's going to be George. I didn't put Leclerc in when we got asked this on the Blatantly Biased Racing podcast because Leclerc drives for a little Italian team called Ferrari who basically have not only a situation where they constantly make bad strategies, they fuck up their car, but also it just brings bad luck. And that double DNF today kind of proves that. Look, Leclerc could be third, but I think at this stage it's very unlikely. The way I see it is I think it's going to be George just because, yes, Max's peaks are much higher. Today, for example, perfect example of, he would have been third anyway, but ended up with a second. George finished in fifth, was it, or fourth? After all of that, I can't remember now. He was running P6, I think, but Antonelli got he was P4, right? Yeah. So, it's another P4 for George. George is constantly P3, P4, P5. And I think the simple fact is, for most of the rest of the races, for the next 9 races, I think it's a case of it will be 1-2s for McLaren. It should have been today, but Norris, unfortunately for Norris anyway, not for Hadjar or the rest of us watching, Norris got the DNF, right? My point on that is normally the drivers fighting for third in the championship are going to be fighting for third to fifth place in each race. So the swing in points isn't massive, and George can just kind of consistently rack up these P3 to P5s, which he seems to do every single weekend. Whereas Max is kind of looking at those peaks, and those peaks now will be third place. Whereas I think those really bad races could be 7th or 8th, like I would not be surprised if at Monza next week or this weekend, Max is P6, P7, right? Maybe not because the car is pretty aero efficient, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was P6, P7, for example. And there's a few other races where that's going to be the case too. Like I would not be surprised if at Singapore, maybe even at, where else would we go? I don't know. Like, Abu Dhabi, there's going to be a few races where he's going to be way down. And I think those are the races where just by week in, week out being P3, P4, P5, George will just rack up those points. And I don't think there's going to be enough between them. But yeah, it's going to be a fight between Max and George, definitely. I think Leclerc is out with this one, but the fight for P3 in the standings, I'm going to give to George just for consistency. Not a bash against Max. I just think the Mercedes will be more consistently there. The question will be how often can Max have these peaks, these P2s, P3s? Because if he can get more of those, then obviously he wins. But I don't know. I just don't see it happening that often like this weekend. Next question. Doing a little bit of French there for Hadjar. What an epic race for him. Jeff cuts right to the key question here. Is it all over for Norris? I don't know. I hope not, because I just want to see a title fight. And regardless, we're getting a new world champion this year. So I'm happy regardless of which way it goes. I would have been happier if it was Leclerc or Colapinto getting a championship, but here we are. I don't want to say it's all over, but it's definitely now a massively uphill battle for Norris. The reason I'm not going to say it's all over is, look, it is 34 points and there's only 9 races. So it is quite a mountain to climb. The reason I say that is, like, if Norris was to win every single one of the next 5 races, you would assume that Piastri would be second given his form, and that would still only put Norris 1 point ahead. So it's going to be quite a difficult challenge now for Norris to win. Like, this could be the weekend he looks back on as losing it. But I don't think it's all over because luck can swing massively. I mean, at the end of the day, 5 races ago, I think it was, there was 24 points, 25 points between Norris and Piastri. And I was saying then, I think it's pretty much, all guns blazing for Piastri to win this. And then Piastri had some bad luck. He had Hungary where the strategy went against him. He had Silverstone where he got that really, in my view, unlucky penalty or badly handled penalty. But Piastri has just been the better driver. And I think luck could swing back. Like, all it would take is Norris wins, the next race, 7 points in Monza, for example. Whether that happens or not, who knows? But, Norris wins 1 or 2 races and it's back down to, let's say, 20 points or 16 points, which it well could be 18 points. Sorry. What is it? No, 20 points. Sorry. If Norris wins 2 races and Piastri finished second, right? And then all it takes is Piastri to have a DNF as well. And the luck swings back. So I think it's not all over. But it is a big swing, which makes it very, very difficult. And given how reliable the McLaren has been compared to everyone else this season and last season, it's really unfortunate for Norris, who has been doing a spectacular job. I think, Norris has been driving really, really well since the upgrade at Canada. Not Canada itself, but since then he's been driving very, very well. And I don't even criticize him for qualifying. I just think that Piastri's doing a spectacular job. Piastri got a little bit of a toe. You're talking 12 thousandths between them. That is any just perfect corner, basically. And like I said, the toe as well. But I think the simple fact is, in reality, I think Piastri probably deserves to be 34 points ahead. I think the luck has swung against Piastri recently, as I said. So I think in terms of just who has been the better driver, Piastri has been. Piastri has been putting everything together under pressure, and Norris has been driving spectacularly this season. It's just little mistakes, little pressure moments getting to him, and I think that's where Piastri's intangibles come ahead. But there's been basically nothing to call between them otherwise. So look, I don't think it's all over. And I don't think it will be all over until the last race. I think Norris will start to eke back out that gap for a little while. Like, I don't think it's going to be clean wins by Piastri going forward. But I think that the thing is for Piastri is that when Norris has a bad day like today, he seems to, and today is not his fault, but whenever he has a bad day, he seems to have a really, really bad day. You know, like Brazil didn't just go bad for him last year. It went spectacularly bad for him last year. You know, Monza went from bad to worse last year. You know, so when Norris has a really bad day, he has a really bad day. And Piastri, when he has something go wrong, seems to just go right. Like in Hungary, for example, sure, it went wrong, but he minimized it. He still finished second. You know, he made sure he got past Leclerc, which was happening anyway. But point is, he minimizes the issues. So my money would be on Piastri anyway. But yeah, I think now it's just more likely than ever it's going to go Piastri's way. But who knows? Like, luck can swing back and forth. And at the end of the day, like, this weekend looked like it was going to go to 2 points instead of 16. And now it's at 34. So things can change very, very quickly in Formula One. And Norris could go on and run a races. Norris could get in the mood of like, well, I'm not winning this championship anyway, so I'm just going to have fun and see where I go. But yeah, so to answer the question simply, Jeff, like, is it all over? No, but it's properly a mountain for Norris. And if it was the other way around, I still think Piastri would be winning, because I think Piastri would just maximize every single weekend, and I think he would close that gap. Whereas I could see Norris fumbling more points, you know, over the next few races, just given how he seems to be under pressure and so on. Not all over, but yeah, I think it's going to make it more tough, isn't it? Well, it's obviously making it more tough for Norris. Let's see. It's just a quick interruption to say that over 80% of you watching this aren't subscribed, and that hurts my feelings. So if you're going to leave a comment to insult me below, as many of you do, why not subscribe while you're down there? Well, do it for me. Just hit the subscribe. Oh, and also before we get back to the video, real quick one. As you all know, I've moved the automotive content that I was trying on this channel over to the Car Nerd. So if you are popping down to subscribe, I'll leave a link to that in the first comment and in the description. Please give that a subscribe as well. It would really help me out. And without ado, let's jump back to the video. Next question. Alan asks, with Horner no longer in for Cadillac or Ferrari, where does he go? Yeah, so this is the news that Cadillac didn't offer a non-denial denial. They flat out put a denial of, we're not talking to Horner at the moment, or they're not talking to him full stop. I didn't really, I know people thought Cadillac just because I think everyone has this blatant idea that Horner basically won't go to a team unless he can control the engine, right? Like, because of how it went with Red Bull. But I just don't think that's a stopping point for Horner, because like Horner won championships. In fact, Horner won all of his championships without having an engine that was his own, right? He just wanted to control that for the future. So there's nothing to say, like, when he goes to a new team, that's a sticking point for him, that he wants it to be a works team. Like, I think everyone hangs up on that too much. I think the key issue here is he wants stake in the game, ownership in the game. And I think given the ownership of Cadillac, I thought it would be possible but unlikely that Cadillac would be willing to give him like a 20 or 30% stake in the team. I just thought, like, you know, they're in the investing phase. Like, it made sense in many ways because it's kind of a carbon cut of like Red Bull early days. I just don't think they were willing to give that percentage away, given how much they're putting in and how little he can put in money-wise. And I think they also probably see this as a long-term project anyway to build. And also, like GM and Cadillac, I don't know if they're, if they're willing to have someone like, with all of the kind of bad publicity around them as Horner right now anyway. So I just didn't see it happening. Ferrari, I didn't see happening just because I think, one, they have Fred, and I think they're not going to want to change and have instability again right now. Two, Hamilton's there. I think that's less of an issue because I don't see him being there in the long term, to be honest, given his performance. And three, I just don't think Horner wants to go to Ferrari. Like, the simple fact is, Horner's definitely, if he's not getting a stake at Red Bull, he was never getting a stake at Ferrari. And I think that's a sticking point for him. And two, the chaos at Red Bull is bad enough without going to absolute chaos of the board in Ferrari. So why would you get kicked out of one board and then go to the worst board on the grid? So Ferrari's just never happening for me. The simple fact is, I still stand where I did before. I think, for me, it's Alpine with an outside chance of Audi. And the reason I say that is I think Audi could look at the situation of Mercedes and think to themselves, right, like, we could give him basically a loan, like Volkswagen could give him a loan basically, of like, we'll give you 20% and you pay it off with, performances or with whatever, over time, instead of a payout, like instead of paying you your annual fee, it's just paid off with equity. Like they could do something like that. And he would be the perfect guy to run that team. The reason I don't see that happening is I think Audi right now, things are on the up, and they have Mattia Binotto, they have Jonathan Wheatley, and things are turning around without needing to give someone a stake. So I just, no pun intended on stake or kick there. Alpine, on the other hand, it's the ideal situation, right? The Alpine brand and Renault themselves, they've removed the engine. They are clearly not wanting to be as hands-on at the team as they were before. They've already sold part of it to the investment group in the UK. One way or the other, Horner could get some sort of buy-in, because the consortium who've already bought 24% might be interested in backing Horner, or Alpine and Renault might be interested in giving Horner a discounted buyout for it, because they could keep the Alpine brand name on, as like a title sponsor, be much cheaper for them. Horner could also bring in some consortium, some people to buy it out. Flavio would have lots of wealthy friends, and as does Horner with Bernie and so on. And it's also a team that doesn't mind bad publicity because it's literally run by Flavio Briatore. And the only things I think stopping it are twofold. One is it's a Mercedes engine for next year, which means Toto is supplying Horner with an engine. I don't think that's as big a sticking point as people think it is, because I think that's a signed deal and there's probably nothing that can be done about it. Horner comes in and has 1 to 2 to maybe 3 years with the engine, begrudgingly of Toto. And, Toto knows that Alpine's not going to beat the works team. Like, McLaren is the one he's probably worried about. So beating Horner with the same engine will be a nice little kind of consolation prize in the interim. And then Horner will have to be given an engine by someone else anyway under the regulations. So he gets an Audi, a Ferrari, or a Honda under the regulation set. So I don't think that's as big of a sticking point as people make it out to be. And then the other sticking point is Flavio. But I think Flavio is the transitional leader. Like, he's not the long-term leadership of the team. And also Flavio and Horner get on. So I could very much see a situation where Flavio does exactly what Horner needs him to do, which is Horner comes in, takes over the CEO and team principal role from Flavio, basically controls the team, gets a 20% stake, either by being essentially given it or by finding some people to back him to do it. And then Flavio turns into the Helmut Marko role, which is doing the things that Horner didn't like doing, firing people, dealing with drivers, that kind of thing, being the hard-nosed guy who's willing to just drop a driver at a drop of a hat if he wants. So I think Alpine for me, it just makes the most sense. And I would not be surprised if by January, that's what it is. I just don't see any other place for him to go. Cadillac's off the table. Ferrari was never really an option in my book anyway. Mercedes obviously isn't for obvious reasons. Red Bull is gone. McLaren not happening for obvious reasons as well. Haas, I just don't think so because Gene Haas isn't willing to sell. And unless Toyota take over and want Horner and are willing to give him money, I don't see that either. As I've already discussed, I don't see Stake being there. V-Carb, obvious reasons. Aston Martin, I just no. Like, it's Andy Cowell and Newey. I just don't see that happening. It could, but I really don't see it. I just don't see any of these happening. So, yeah, my money's on Alpine, 100%. Next question. What do we got here? So, Sophia says, why did Cadillac go so conservative? Yeah, I can see why people think that Perez and Bottas as a lineup is quite dull. I think most people, you would say you want like an experienced one, either Bottas or Perez, with a young driver, preferably, one of the young Americans. Bring Palou over, get Alex Dunn in from F2 next year, go for like a hotshot young kid to come up and basically recreate the Formula One movie. But I think this is good for me in terms of, look, I don't really watch, I'm a weirdo. I don't really watch Formula One for the drivers. The drivers are interesting, obviously. I watch Formula One for the teams, for the strategy, mainly for the technical stuff. I love the technical stuff. And honestly, Cadillac are coming from a back foot. Cadillac next year are most likely going to be most concerned about actually qualifying for the races. What I mean by that is, for those of you who don't know, if you are 7% off the pace in Q1, so if you're doing a 1 minute, say a 1 minute qualifying, the maximum the back can be off that is 1 minute, 7 seconds. Am I calculating that right? Probably not. You know what I mean, though. It's 107%. The 7% slower is what you can be than the worst driver below you, I think it is. Or is it off the top? Maybe it's off the fastest. Yeah, it might be off the fastest in Q1. Maybe. I can't remember the exact thing. But basically, there is a limit to how slow you can go in qualifying to be allowed in the race. Now, they can overrule this and do a lot. Like, you see DNFs in races, for example. So when you DNF in Q1 and you don't set a lap time, or if you're taking a penalty, that's why they go out and set a lap time, because otherwise you have to appeal to the stewards to basically give you a waiver for the 107%. So if they're doing that every weekend, they're not going to get that waiver. And we've already seen this in 2010, 11, and 12. With, the old teams. The 107% was brought in because Marussia and HRT and all these guys were so far off the back of the pack that they basically weren't qualifying for races. So they brought this in to make sure there's some competitive level that the teams need to be at. So that's really what they're focused on. And therefore, you want two experienced hands, especially Bottas is an epic qualifier. Perez isn't slow in qualifying. It's just the races are his strong point. He had trouble against Max in that car, which is fair. But I think there's twofold. You want that. So you want the guys who are going to get the most out of it. You also want the guys who are going to have the least amount of DNFs. And Perez and Bottas, say what you will about Perez at Red Bull, but generally speaking over their career, they haven't been, messy drivers. They've brought it home. They've got the points. So you want someone like a Perez, a Bottas, a Hülkenberg, someone who's just going to bring the car home, get as close to possible as points, and also that can give you strong experience feedback. And both of these guys were at top teams before. They can tell you what Mercedes and what Red Bull did that was right. They've also both been at midfield teams, at the back, at back markers. They can tell you all this stuff and they can give you proper experience feedback and direction on the car. I think it's a pragmatic approach. Yes, I think it's a little bit boring. I do. But I also love both of those guys. I'm a massive Perez fan. So, and Bottas is an interesting guy. I think it'll go like this. Bottas will qualify better. Perez will beat him in the races, but we'll see. But look, boring, sure. But I think it's a very, very pragmatic choice. And I think it was the smartest one for them to go with. And I think for me, it tells me that they're serious about performance. And that for me is good. Like, because a lot of new teams that take over, they want the flashy, glitzy kind of, look at this new kid we brought in. And if they did that, I'd be a little bit concerned that they're not taking it seriously, just what a challenge they have ahead of them. And I think this is where Graham Loudon is a good choice, because he has literally seen, a team come on and fail at Virgin Marussia. So I think it's pragmatic. All right, last question. Aeroplay AF says, why does driver of the day close before the end of the race when the last laps can be so defining? This is an interesting one. I don't actually know, and I didn't realize it closes before the end of the race. I guess it does, right? Because they do 10 laps until the end, but it doesn't close out after the finish line. It closes out, I think, on the second to last lap, or like at the end of the penultimate lap. And you can have like last lap defining moments. So it's a good question. I don't know why. I guess it's because people basically tune out a lot at the end of the race. So you want to be able to show like the driver coming over, you show the 1, 2, 3, and then the driver of the day pops up. So if you're closing it literally like at the last lap, at the end of the last lap, your system's still calculating. I honestly don't think that's a big issue, because basically it's doing a running calculation anyway, because they show like the percentage that they have. So they can just show it in real time as you come over even if you did it where it was like, as the first driver crosses the finish line, that's when it's hit. But yeah, I thought it was calculated then, but I could be wrong. Honestly though, if I'm honest, I don't think it's a big deal, because the driver of the day is a popularity contest anyway. Like, we've seen so many times where, the winner of the race has a spectacular win, but the guy who goes from 10th to 4th will win it anyway, because we like the underdog stories. The driver of the day is usually about like the underdog, the guy who comes through the field, like Hadjar today, for example, or Leclerc with that epic move and so on. So I get your point. I just don't think, like, in the last 2 laps of the race, I think most people have already put their driver of the day vote in anyway. But it's an interesting one. I need to look into that. And I'm sorry, this is a piss poor answer. I thought it was calculated like right at that moment of the finishing line anyway. But you're right. I think it's calculated like on the penultimate lap. I think it closes on the penultimate lap. So yeah. Why is it done? I guess so there's not like some random spike to game at the end. Maybe because of people playing with it in the past, where people weren't like voting for Mazepin at the end of the race just because they didn't want Norris to get like driver of the day and stuff. But yeah, there's no good reason for it other than calculating, I guess. That would be my only answer. Sorry, I don't have a better answer on that. That is the end of the show. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next week. Please do subscribe as always. And thank you so much.